March 23rd, 1943. 5:40 a.m. El Guettar, Tunisia. The first light crept across the dunes, brushing the sand with pale gold, while a cold wind slipped through the olive scrub. From the low valley came the uneven rumble of tank engines, coughing awake a metallic rhythm that mixed with the smell of diesel and dust. Inside the narrow hull of an M1340, Sergeant Enrico Rinaldi pulled on his gloves and listened to the coughing growl that meant his tank was alive barely. It was a sound he both trusted and feared, the voice of a machine too old for the war it had been sent to fight. He checked his watch. 05:43. The Americans were near. His crew had been ready since midnight, polishing optics scratched by sand-stacking shells that rattled inside chipped cases. They whispered about the Shermans, the new American tanks said to move like beasts made of iron and oil. Rinaldi had seen their tracks the day before, wide, deep, confident. He tried to believe that courage could close the gap between 30 millimeters of Italian steel and 50 of American armor. The desert, he told himself, was the great equalizer. When the sun lifted free of the horizon, he saw them. Dark shapes moving in perfect line, the Shermans advancing without hesitation. Their turrets turned with a smooth hum that mocked the hand-cranked struggle of his own gun. Through the glass they looked almost graceful. For every nervous breath inside the Italian hull, the Americans seemed to exhale calm. "Hold fire," Rinaldi said quietly. The loader's hands trembled. The driver whispered, "They don't even hide." Rinaldi answered, "They don't have to." At 800 yards, the first Sherman fired. The desert shook. A burst of dust slammed against Rinaldi's vision slit, and a heartbeat later, another shell screamed past. The Italian guns answered. Sparks bloomed where their rounds struck the enemy, bright but harmless. 2 hits, no penetration. Hit, the gunner shouted. "No effect," Rinaldi replied. "Adjust left. Fire again." The gun recoiled, ringing inside the turret like a bell. Through the haze, he saw the American tank roll forward, untouched, its barrel lowering slightly, deliberate, unhurried. The return shot came through the front plate and out the rear in a single line of flame. He climbed out through the hatch into the blinding light. The air reeked of oil smoke and cordite. To his left, another M13 burned crew trapped inside. The valley was turning into a graveyard. 5 minutes, 5 losses. The Shermans advanced methodically, their engines humming a steady note. The rhythm was worse than rage. It was confidence measured in horsepower. By 06:10, the Americans had pushed 6 miles per hour through the Italian front. Their formation looked choreographed: halt, aim, fire, roll. The shells fell like punctuation marks in a sentence that only one side understood. Rinaldi's radio crackled, "Sector 3 collapsing. Fall back if possible." He looked at the wrecks around him and answered, "There's nowhere left to fall back to." When his tank took its final hit, the track snapped and folded like a broken wrist. He and the remaining crew crawled into a shallow trench, watching the Shermans crest the ridge in sunlight. For every Italian machine burning, another pair of American silhouettes appeared. The smell of scorched metal hung over the valley like incense for a lost cause. That evening, after the firing stopped, Rinaldi wrote in his notebook, "We fought as men, but they fought as a system." Out of 36 Italian tanks that entered El Guettar that morning, only 14 escaped. 3 Shermans were knocked out, all recovered within a day. The numbers were cruel but honest. Bravery could not replace thickness of steel or the tempo of factories that never slept. As night settled over the desert, the wind cooled the wrecks until they ticked softly, each tank sighing its heat into the sand. Somewhere down the line, one crippled engine tried to start again, one last weak cough that echoed through the dark before dying away. The men listened in silence. They knew that sound would stay with them long after the war, the metallic cough of diesel fading into the wind, the last breath of an age that no courage could save. And from that morning at El Guettar began the lesson that would define the rest of the campaign, the moment when faith met machinery and the future did not blink. Before the war reached North Africa, the Italian army had built its tank doctrine around the idea of movement, not endurance. The desert, they believed, rewarded speed and courage more than armor or firepower. In 1939, Italian planners called it La Guerra di Manovra, the war of maneuver, a doctrine born from the memories of cavalry and colonial raids. Their M11 and M13 tanks were designed to move quickly across open plains to exploit fear and dust rather than absorb punishment. What they did not understand was that the next war would no longer reward dash. It would reward design. In the brief wars of the 1930s, the old philosophy had worked. Against poorly armed opponents in Ethiopia or Spain, light armor and bold crews had been enough. A tank that could reach 20 miles per hour and carry a 47mm gun looked respectable on paper. But by 1943, the paper was a relic. The Americans brought to Tunisia a new kind of weapon, one that embodied the logic of mass and repetition. The M4 Sherman was not the heaviest tank in the world, nor the most elegant. It was, however, reliable, interchangeable, and designed for the factory floor as much as the battlefield. To the Italians, it looked like arrogance in metal form, a tank that didn't need finesse to win. The Americans could afford mistakes. They could afford to trade armor for time, fuel for ground. Every hour somewhere across the Atlantic, a factory stamped out another replacement. For every M1340 built in Turin, the United States produced 10 Shermans. For every broken track that stopped an Italian unit for half a day, an American crew could change theirs in 20 minutes. Italian officers wrote that the desert punished maintenance as much as morale. Sand-clogged filters burned out gearboxes, jammed turrets. The diesel engines that had been a point of pride were now slow to start and heavy to repair. "We fight with tanks that breathe dust and die of thirst," one captain noted. They carried fuel in barrels strapped to the sides, a death sentence when struck. In contrast, the Sherman's gasoline engines, though hotter and noisier, were easy to service, built with standardized parts that any mechanic in any depot could replace. Doctrine blinded the Italian high command. They imagined tank combat as a duel between knights, not a contest between machines. They valued spirit over system, heroics over logistics. Even when reports came from Libya describing the British Crusaders and American Grants outranging Italian guns' headquarters in Rome, insisted that new tactics would compensate. Orders went out to close the distance quickly, to attack before the enemy could coordinate. It sounded brave on paper. In the field, it was suicide. The crews understood before the generals did. They saw how the Sherman's guns stabilized, even while moving, how it fired on the run, with frightening accuracy. The M13 had to halt a line and fire, taking precious seconds that meant life or death. The Americans hit their mark on the first shot more often than not. One Italian gunner wrote later, "They seemed to aim with the rhythm of their heartbeat." Another blind spot was communication. Italian radios were unreliable, often silent in combat. Dust and heat corroded circuits, and the crews resorted to hand signals or flares. Meanwhile, every Sherman was a moving node in a network, sharing coordinates, adjusting fire, spreading data faster than Italian command could even confirm enemy position. It was not merely a battle of tanks. It was a battle of tempo. To men like Rinaldi, the realization came slowly but painfully. They were fighting a war already decided by distance and delay. Italian supply lines stretched thin, parts came weeks late, and ammunition shipments often contained mismatched shells. They still believed courage could fill the gaps. But every time they met a formation of Shermans, they learned how quickly courage could be measured, usually in seconds. Still, the high command kept the faith. Reports of temporary reverses were rewritten as local readjustments. Factories in Italy were bombed, yet official communiques claimed production was increasing. They issued new slogans, velocità e vita, speed is life. But speed meant nothing when engines failed to start, or when armor cracked at the first hit. In trying to move faster, they simply died sooner. By the spring of 1943, Italian commanders could no longer deny what the crews already knew. The Sherman was not just a machine. It was a doctrine made visible, a belief that wars were won by process, not passion. The Americans fought with geometry, line of fire angle, of armor spacing, of formations. The Italians fought with intuition, pride, and outdated maps. One prisoner of war later told his interrogator, "We believed that a good man could defeat a better tank. But we learned that a good tank makes an average man unstoppable." It was not defeat he spoke of, it was revelation. By the end of March, the Italian tank battalions near El Guettar had been reduced to less than half strength. Replacement vehicles arrived with worn engines, crews with only days of training. The American lines moved like a tide and the Italians like stones beneath it. Yet even then, amid the wreckage, the doctrine held. Rome still sent orders insisting on counterattack, as if valor could be assembled faster than armor plate. But in the valleys of Tunisia, among the blackened shells of M13s and the humming advance of Shermans, a new truth had already taken root. The war was no longer about who fired first or who stood bravest. It was about who could keep firing after the others were gone. And the men of Ariete and Littorio, who had once believed the desert belonged to those who dared, now faced the lesson that daring alone could no longer conquer the machine age. The sand that once carried their tracks now carried the echo of something larger, the steady mechanical heartbeat of an army that fought by multiplication, not miracle. And for the first time, the Italians began to understand that this was not a passing mismatch, but the shape of a future already written in steel and smoke. By April, the wrecks at El Guetar had been dragged into shallow ravines, half buried by wind and sand. The desert never forgot, but it covered what it could. Each burned-out M13 stood like a black monument to lessons learned the hardest way possible. The men who survived were scattered, some reassigned to reconnaissance units, others absorbed into mixed German battalions where their tanks were treated as curiosities, not assets. What they carried from the valley was not pride but knowledge, and it was written in the smell of diesel and burnt paint that clung to their uniforms. The first lesson was brutal in its simplicity. The Italian tanks could not trade blows. Every engagement with Shermans ended the same way, one side firing calmly, the other hoping to survive long enough to reload. The M13's 47mm gun, once advertised as fast and agile, could not penetrate the Sherman's frontal armor even at 400 yards. Crews began to aim for tracks, optics, or rear plates, anything that offered a chance to wound. Don't stand and dual circle and sting became the whispered rule. Yet circling meant moving, and moving meant exposing thin side armor. The Italians discovered that maneuver without protection was just a slower form of surrender. The second lesson came from the heat. Desert temperatures cooked engines and baked ammunition. The M13's air filters clogged within hours, and the lubricants turned to sludge. Mechanics invented tricks, wrapping filters in damp cloth, pouring olive oil into gearboxes when supply supplies ran dry. They joked that their tanks were partly made of farms, but the laughter was thin. Each improvisation carried a cost: slower movement, shorter lifespan, greater risk of fire. They learned that ingenuity could delay defeat, but never cancel it. A young driver named Carlo Benedetti wrote home after his first battle near Gafsao. "I pressed the throttle, but the tank hesitated. It was like asking an old man to run." His letter ended with a line that officers would later quote in their reports. "We fight in machines that are brave but tired." That phrase became the quiet confession of an army caught between courage and decay. The third lesson was human. In the beginning, Italian crews believed that experience would compensate for inferior machines. Many were veterans of Libya, men who had fought in dust storms and ambushes, who knew how to read the desert like a map. But the Sherman erased those advantages. It didn't care about tricks or dunes or bravado. It fought the same way every time, methodically, predictably, relentlessly. The Italians learned that modern war was no longer a duel between men, but between systems that punished improvisation. They also learned from their German allies. The panzer crews they fought alongside respected Italian bravery, but mocked their doctrine. "Courage is not a replacement part," one German officer remarked. The Italians listened, half offended, half convinced. German tankers showed them how to angle armor, how to use the terrain as shield, how to fire and reverse without exposing their flanks. Some of these tactics worked once. The problem was never the crew's skill. It was the tank's limits. The M13 was too tall, too underpowered, too thin-skinned. Every improvement in tactics only revealed another mechanical flaw. The high command tried to respond. Orders were issued for field modifications, extra plates welded to hulls, sandbags stacked on turrets, jerry cans filled with sand to act as improvised armor. None of it changed the outcome. The added weight broke suspensions, cracked wheels slowed the tanks to crawling pace. When they finally reached the front, the Shermans had already advanced another mile. The Italian engineers in Tripoli proposed a redesign, a heavier turret, a longer gun, thicker armor. The blueprints were promising. The factories were not. Allied bombers struck the Ansaldo works before a single prototype could leave the line. The crews in Tunisia heard rumors of a new P-40 tank coming to save them. It never arrived. By the time the first production model was ready, the war in Africa was already lost. In the field, the lessons turned bitter. Rinaldi's unit, now reduced to a few working tanks, began escorting German supply convoys instead of leading assaults. He wrote in his logbook, "We used to hunt. Now we survive." His tone had shifted from defiance to resignation. The war was teaching faster than Rome could learn. Amid this slow collapse, one principle emerged, whispered first among mechanics, then passed up the chain of command. Don't trust what you can't repair in the field. It was the desert's version of a proverb, a truth hammered into the hands of anyone who touched a wrench or a gun. If a tank couldn't be fixed with what fit in a truck, it wasn't a weapon, it was a liability. There were moments of ingenuity that bordered on brilliance. Crews stripped captured British crusaders for spare parts, rewired radios using telephone cords, even mounted German machine guns atop Italian turrets. Some tanks went into battle with 5 different nations' components stitched together. But even the most creative patchwork couldn't change what was happening. The war had become an equation of output and replacement, and Italy had run out of both. By May, after a dozen engagements, Rinaldi's battalion had turned into a foot unit. Their remaining tanks were immobile bunkers used as artillery pieces buried halfway in sand. One morning, a captured American sergeant brought in after his jeep hit a mine, looked at the wrecks and asked in disbelief, "You really went up against Shermans with those?" Rinaldi didn't answer. He just gestured at the burned hulls and said, "We did until they stopped moving." That silence became the final lesson. The Italians understood that bravery could no longer be measured by how long one held position, but by how long one could endure humiliation without breaking. They had paid for every inch of that valley with lives and with realization. In the ruins of their camps, scrawled across the wall of a maintenance shed, someone had written a new aphorism in charcoal: "Don't pray for better luck, build better machines." It was half a joke, half a prophecy. The men who wrote it did not know that in a few years' time their words would become the mantra of every nation that survived the war. But for now, it was just a note left in the sand by soldiers who had learned everything too late. The tanks rusted where they fell. The wind erased their tracks, but not their message. In those wrecks lay the tuition of an army that had believed courage was enough, and discovered that the price of belief, when paid in steel and blood, could never be refunded. The desert morning of April 7th, 1943 began with silence, a silence so sharp that it made the sand seem hollow. For the men of the Ariete Division's remaining tank regiment, the quiet was not peace but warning. They were ordered to hold a shallow ridge south of Macnassi, a line of rough stone and brittle shrubs that offered no real cover. To the west, columns of American Shermans gathered under the haze, sunlight glinting off their gun barrels. For the Italians, this would not be a grand battle or a noble stand. It would be a test: could cunning and courage still bend a machine that outclassed them in every measurable way? Rinaldi's crew had rebuilt their tank overnight. They had scavenged a replacement gun sight from a wrecked British Valentine and welded a cracked armor plate with melted tin cans. The M13 groaned as they rolled it into position, the treads screeching like rusted chains. "It's like asking a mule to race a train," the driver muttered. Rinaldi only smiled, though there was no humor in it. He had stopped believing in miracles. What he believed in now was geometry, angles, distances, timing. The desert was no longer a stage for gallantry, but a map of equations. The plan was desperate, but clever. The Italian commander, Colonel De Marchi, had studied how the Shermans advanced steady intervals, overlapping fields of fire, predictable arcs. He saw a rhythm, a machine's heartbeat. He decided to break it. His tanks would not attack head-on. Instead, they would bury half their hulls into shallow pits, exposing only turrets. Behind them, a second line of anti-tank guns and captured German 50mm cannons would cover the flanks. They would let the Americans come close, draw them into the range where even an old Italian gun could punch through at a perfect angle. It was a trap built not on hope, but on mathematics. At 0720, the first Shermans appeared, 18 of them moving in disciplined formation. Their engines murmured through the valley, the same mechanical heartbeat that had haunted the Italians since El Guetar. Rinaldi whispered to his loader, "Oh, wait for the dust." The Sherman's approach kicked up a brown wall of sand, a curtain that turned the horizon into smoke. When the first tank broke through, Rinaldi's gunner fired. The shell struck low and right, ricocheting off. He adjusted, fired again. The second shot found the track, locking the Sherman in place. It was not destruction, but it was the first time in weeks the Italians had made an enemy tank stop. The field erupted in noise, guns barking, sand spraying, metal shrieking. The Italians fired in volleys, each round calculated, each moment bought with seconds of survival. Rinaldi's M13 shuddered with every recoil. He could see the hit markers on the Sherman's scratches, dense scorch marks, but the enemy kept moving. Still, the trap worked. The Americans, confident as always, had driven straight into the killing ground. Their formation faltered when one of their lead tanks exploded from a hidden 50mm strike, the turret popping like a cork. For a fleeting moment, the Italians held the rhythm. Colonel DeMarchi's voice came through the radio. "Now! Forward 10 meters! Fire at will!" The tanks lurched ahead, bursting from their pits. For 2 glorious minutes, the battlefield felt balanced. The Shermans hesitated, turning their turrets, seeking targets. Smoke curled upward, and the valley filled with the overlapping thunder of guns. One Italian shot hit a Sherman's ammunition rack, an explosion so violent that it rolled another tank onto its side. The men inside the M13s cheered. Rinaldi's loader shouted, "They can bleed!" For the first time since Tunisia, they felt like soldiers again, not targets. But geometry, like luck, never lasts. The Shermans adjusted within minutes. Their commanders spotted the flanking guns called Ordnance and unleashed a wall of fire. The valley turned into an oven. One by one, the anti-tank emplacements vanished in bursts of dust and flame. Rinaldi saw a line of tracer rounds cut through the air, each one burning a path toward his position. He reversed downhill, but the sand bogged the tank. The driver cursed. The engine roared. The treads spun uselessly. At 0746, an armor-piercing shell struck the ridge beside them, showering the tank with debris. The gunner slumped forward, blood trickling down his cheek. "We stay," Rinaldi said flatly. He loaded the next shell himself and fired through the smoke. The shot hit another Sherman at an angle, gouging a crater in its turret. For a moment he thought it might penetrate. It didn't. The American tank turned, aimed, and fired once. The blast hit just below Rinaldi's gun, tearing the front armor open like paper. The M13 lurched, belching black smoke. Rinaldi climbed out, coughing, half-blind. Around him, the ridge was littered with wrecks, his comrades' tanks burning in neat lines like tombstones laid by a draftsman. The trap had worked only long enough to prove a point precision could momentarily level power, but only power could endure. When the firing stopped, the valley looked like a foundry. Smoke fire, molten metal cooling in slow sighs. American engineers moved in hours later, inspecting the damage, towing their wounded tanks away. One officer reportedly said, "They fought smarter than we expected." It was faint praise, but it reached Rinaldi's ears through a translator days later in captivity. He didn't smile. "Smarter," he said, "but not faster." That day, the Italians destroyed 4 Shermans and disabled 3 more, numbers that meant nothing against the tide that followed. Yet within those few hours, something shifted. The survivors began to see the war not as an endless humiliation, but as an education. They had discovered the anatomy of defeat, the difference between bravery and efficiency, between improvisation and integration. They had proven that even the most outdated force, when disciplined by necessity, could still wound its conqueror. As night fell over Macnassi, the wind carried the familiar scent of diesel and smoke, the same metallic breath that had opened the campaign. The men who lived through the battle did not call it a victory, but they remembered it as the day they learned to fight like their enemy, methodical, calculating, unromantic. For a brief moment, the desert had allowed them to rewrite the rhythm of war. And though the sand would soon bury their tracks again, the echo of that rhythm, measured in recoil, smoke, and shattered gears, would become the sound of understanding. The war was no longer about who dared more. It was about who learned faster. By the end of April 1943, the lessons carved into the sands of Tunisia began to ripple beyond the battlefield. The few surviving tank crews of Ariete and Littorio divisions were withdrawn to the rear lines near Enfidaville ordered to regroup, refit, and retrain under German supervision. Their tanks were mostly wrecks patched together with scavenged parts from half a dozen nations. Yet even as they limped off the front, the high command spoke as though a new dawn was possible. The phrase passed from desk to dispatch, riorganizzazione meccanizzata, mechanized reorganization. It sounded modern, ambitious, almost American. At first, the words meant nothing more than survival. The Italian army no longer had the means to build entirely new tanks, but it had men who understood what had gone wrong. Rinaldi found himself reassigned to a maintenance unit outside Susse. His new battlefield was a row of workshops built under canvas, where crippled M14s were stripped, rearmed, and reborn as hybrids. Some mounted captured German 50mm guns. Others had their turrets removed and replaced with makeshift fixed mounts for short-barreled howitzers. A few became mobile supply carriers. It was war by adaptation, not production. But for the first time, adaptation felt systematic. German advisors observed the process with a mix of amusement and respect. They recognized ingenuity when they saw it. "You Italians," one panzer mechanic joked, "build with hope and wire." Rinaldi smiled but kept working. Hope and wire were all they had. Yet the rhythm of the repair yards began to change. Crews no longer waited for orders from Rome. They learned to solve problems locally. An engine part from a captured Crusader tank might fit an Italian gearbox. A damaged Panzer road wheel could be welded onto an M13 chassis. These small acts of improvisation began to form a doctrine of their own, one not written in manuals but in hands scarred by wrenches and heat. Each rebuilt tank became a symbol of defiance. They called them Bastardi di Ferro, iron bastards. The nickname spread through the camps with pride. When the Shermans came again, they would not face polished machines, but monsters of mixed heritage. The Italians knew they could not win the war, but they could still shape how it remembered them. The next skirmishes proved the idea wasn't foolish. Near Infidaville, a platoon of modified M13s ambushed an American convoy at close range, destroying 6 trucks and 1 tank before retreating without a single loss. It was a tiny victory, strategically irrelevant, but emotionally enormous. These moments convinced surviving officers that lessons from El Guettar and Macnassi were not wasted. Reports circulated through the command chain, blunt and unsparing. One stated, "Armor without tempo is a tomb. Fire without coordination is waste. Courage without logistics is theater." The words were anonymous, but historians would later suspect Rinaldi wrote them. The tone was too plain, too bitterly honest to be bureaucratic. Rome took notice too late, but sincerely. The Ansaldo factory, miraculously still operating after repeated air raids, resumed work on the long-delayed P-40 heavy tank. It carried a 75mm gun and nearly twice the armor of the M13. On paper, it was Italy's answer to the Sherman. In reality, production lagged behind disaster. Only a few prototypes were completed before Italy's surrender in September. Still within those unfinished hulls lay the ghost of a transformation proof that even under ruin a country could try to learn. Meanwhile, in the field, the Germans integrated Italian crews into their armored units. The Italians brought with them lessons forged in humiliation and adapted them with startling efficiency. They manned self-propelled guns, reconnaissance vehicles, and repair convoys. German officers noted their discipline and improvisation. One report read, "They lack armor, but not intelligence. They adapt faster than we expected." It was the first acknowledgement that the men who had once fought with outdated tanks had become tacticians of necessity. Rinaldi watched this evolution with mixed emotion. He trained new crews, teaching them what no manual could capture: the rhythm of defeat, the mathematics of survival. "Don't aim for glory," he told them. "Aim for function." His students listened, not out of obedience, but because they had seen what happened to those who didn't. The myth of the heroic duel had died. In its place grew a colder faith in precision, patience, and process. By summer, the Italian remnants fought almost like engineers, repairing as they retreated, cannibalizing wrecks, turning defeat into logistics. The Shermans, ever relentless, followed their engines humming, the same industrial hymn. Yet something subtle had changed. American intelligence began to notice the increased accuracy of Italian ambushes, the speed of their field repairs, the reduced chaos in their retreats. The Italians had found rhythm at last, not factory rhythm, but survival rhythm. there were still moments of horror. Allied air power erased entire columns in minutes. Supplies vanished, fuel convoys burned, and the Mediterranean blockade strangled every hope of reinforcement. But within that collapse, a strange efficiency emerged. Crews pre-measured fuel consumption, to the leader-timed engine runs, to avoid detection, even mapped escape routes, using captured American aerial photos. Each destroyed tank became a classroom, each failure a formula rewritten in blood. Rinaldi's diary from July carried a new tone, no longer despair, but detached observation. We no longer fight to win. We fight to understand. Every battle teaches the next generation what not to build. It was a grim kind of legacy, but it was legacy nonetheless. By August, Italy's armies were a patchwork of units retreating northward under the weight of inevitability. But even in retreat, the change was visible. The tanks moved in tighter formations, communicated more efficiently, and used terrain with near-German precision. The doctrine of improvisation had become their new religion. It was too late to save the campaign, but it ensured their final battles were not fought blindly. When the armistice came in September, Rinaldi stood in a rail yard near Naples, watching as German forces seized the last Italian tanks. His men looked on silently as the symbols of their endurance were rebranded with black crosses. The P-40 prototypes rolled away, engines growling their Italian markings freshly painted over. A young mechanic whispered, "So we built them lessons." Rinaldi nodded. "Yes," he said, "and they learned faster." That night, as Allied searchlights swept the bay, he sat among his crew sketching on the back of an ammunition log. It wasn't a tank or a battle plan, but a diagram of gears and pistons labeled in uneven handwriting. Speed means nothing without rhythm. Rhythm means nothing without repair. He folded the paper and tucked it into his pocket, a relic of understanding in a war that had turned comprehension into currency. The next day, Rinaldi and his men surrendered to an American patrol. The officer who took their weapons was polite, even apologetic. "You fought well," he said. Rinaldi replied softly, "We learned well." The Americans never knew how much weight that sentence carried. It was not pride nor irony, but closure, the acknowledgement that Italy's tankers, once symbols of obsolescence, had become unwilling pioneers of a truth. The world would soon take for granted that in modern war, intelligence does not belong to those who win first, but to those who learn fastest. And somewhere on the desert floor of Tunisia, the twisted remains of an M1340 still rusted beneath the wind, its cracked gun pointed toward the horizon. For all its failures, it had given birth to an idea, small, fragile, but enduring, that knowledge, like armor, is forged only under fire. When the war shifted north in late 1943, Italy's factories became its last front. The once proud industrial heart of Turin, Milan, and Genoa now operated under German supervision, their foundries converted to feed a machine that no longer belonged to them. Smoke still rose from the chimneys, but the rhythm had changed. What had once been a national effort driven by pride became an enforced symphony of survival. Every sound, the clang of a hammer, the hiss of a press, was a negotiation between exhaustion and obligation. Rinaldi, now working under the newly formed Italian Social Republic, found himself in a vast repair depot near Verona. The hangar smelled of oil and cold iron, the scent of a nation being rebuilt from scrap. Rows of damaged tanks stretched to the walls. Italian-German even captured Allied machines, all lined up in states of half-repair. Men moved through the aisles like ghosts welding fitting testing. The Germans called it Nachschubwerkstatt, a supply workshop. To the Italians, it felt like purgatory, not war, not peace, but a slow grind of relevance. Here, Rinaldi witnessed a new kind of war, one measured not in miles gained or tanks destroyed, but in hours of endurance. Every day brought a quota, 10 repairs, 5 refits, 3 engines overhauled. The men worked 12-hour shifts beneath the frozen rafters. They learned to judge success by the rhythm of their tools. If the hammers stop, Rinaldi told his apprentices, someone dies on the front tomorrow. He no longer spoke of courage or fate, only throughput and precision. The Germans ran the operation with cold efficiency. Trains arrived each morning loaded with damaged vehicles from the Gothic line, tracks twisted, turrets cracked, engines burned. They were offloaded, catalogued, and stripped within minutes. Usable components went to a sorting yard, where Italian crews restored them for reuse. In one corner, a sign painted in German read, Zeit ist Panzer, time is a tank. Rinaldi understood it immediately. The phrase became his creed. The work was monotonous but transformative. Italian workers began to internalize the mathematics of logistics. They learned that every repair saved resources equal to weeks of production. They memorized the codes for bolts, bearings, and gear ratios. The more they understood, the faster they moved. Within a month, turnaround times dropped from 72 hours to 30. The Germans noticed and quietly expanded the Italian role. For the first time, these men who had once been treated as auxiliaries were now the custodians of a critical rhythm. It wasn't heroism, but it was mastery. And mastery was the only victory left. Beyond the depots, the same transformation echoed through what remained of the army. Training camps in Lombardy and Piedmont became laboratories of adaptation. Recruits were no longer taught to charge or improvise, but to calculate. They learned the language of machinery, the torque of an engine, the angle of armor, the fuel-to-mile ratio that determined whether a mission lived or died. Instructors spoke less about honor and more about efficiency. A tank crew's survival rate, they taught, could be predicted by one variable: how well they knew their machine. Even in collapse, Italy was learning to industrialize its understanding of war. The army began compiling mechanical field manuals based on frontline experience notes drawn from El Guitar and Macnassi, from the burned hulks that littered the desert. One chapter carried a phrase that could have been Rinaldi's handwriting: lose 10, return 20. It was shorthand for resilience, the logic that defined the American war machine, now translated into Italian pragmatism. The phrase spread quietly among mechanics and soldiers alike, half joke, half aspiration. Yet the irony was cruel. Just as Italy began to understand the rhythm of modern warfare, its capacity to apply it was vanishing. Allied bombers flattened factories faster than they could produce replacements. Rail lines were cut, power grids collapsed, and fuel became a luxury measured in liters, not barrels. The nation had learned the formula of tempo and logistics, only to discover that knowledge without resources was another form of despair. Rinaldi walked the factory floor each night after the shifts ended, the silence pressing against his ears. He traced his hand along the side of a newly repaired tank, its armor cold, its markings still wet. He knew it would not last long. Few machines survived more than 2 weeks at the front. But that didn't matter. What mattered was the process, the relentless, almost spiritual repetition of taking what was broken and making it work again. In the spring of 1944, as the Allied advance pushed into the north, the Verona depot received orders to evacuate. Rinaldi supervised the dismantling of the workshop. Crates of tools, spare parts, and blueprints were loaded onto trucks bound for the Alps. Before leaving, he nailed a small sign to the wall, a phrase scrawled in chalk that no one bothered to erase: we may not win, but we will understand. The convoy moved north, through valleys still echoing with artillery. Behind them, the factory lights flickered out one by one. The war that had begun with dreams of mobility and valor now ended in the measured cadence of assembly lines and spreadsheets. The tank had ceased to be a weapon of bravery. It had become an instrument of arithmetic. As the trucks climbed into the mountains, Rinaldi looked back at the horizon, where smoke from the bombed rail yards curled into the dusk. For a moment, the wind carried the faint metallic cough of diesel, the same sound that had haunted him since El Guitar. But this time, it no longer spoke of failure. It was the sound of persistence, the heartbeat of men who had learned that even in defeat, precision was a kind of immortality. And in that final rhythm, the Italian war machine, broken, commandeered but wiser, kept breathing one rotation at a time. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, the last Italian tanks sat rusting in the foothills of the Alps, cold shells of lessons paid for in full. The war had erased their armies, their factories, and their illusions. Yet in the quiet that followed, something remarkable lingered: understanding. For men like Rinaldi, the end of battle was not an ending, but a reckoning. He walked through the empty yard where he had once rebuilt engines under air raid sirens. The concrete was scarred with burn marks, the walls bullet-pocked. Every dent felt like a line in a manual written by experience itself. The world moved forward quickly, as victors always do. America flooded Europe with its machines, its manuals, its efficiency. The words interchangeability and standardization became the new gospel of engineering. Italy, stripped of empire and industry, was left to rebuild from fragments. But this time it did so with humility and memory. The nation's post-war factories no longer produced weapons but tractors, trucks, and engines designed for reliability first. The same men who once patched tanks now repaired locomotives, designing components that could be swapped, repaired, and reused. It was not military pride that drove them, but a quiet faith in systems that could endure. Rinaldi became an instructor in a vocational institute in Milan. He taught mechanics, not soldiers. His lessons had no rhetoric, no patriotism, only the gospel of rhythm and repair. Precision, he told his students, is not a luxury, it's survival. Sometimes when students asked about the war, he would pause, glance at the oil-stained floor, and say only, "We were brave before we were ready." That was his epitaph for a generation. The spirit of those words lived on in unexpected places. Italian post-war industry, Fiat, Breda, and Saldo, rose from the ashes, not because of ideology, but because of the disciplined pragmatism born in workshops like Verona. Every conveyor belt, every factory schedule, every design manual carried traces of wartime memory. Efficiency had replaced heroics. Adaptation had become identity. Historians would later write that the Italian armored divisions lost every major battle they fought, but they misunderstood the kind of victory that survived. The defeat had stripped away the myth of singular genius, the romance of daring. What remained was the truth that organized quality, even in scarcity, outlasts brilliance born of chance. The war had proven what modernity already knew: systems, not heroes, decide survival. In his later years, Rinaldi returned once to Tunisia. He found the wreckage of his first tank, half buried in sand, its turret sunken like a fossil. He brushed away the dust from the cracked armor and placed his hand on the steel. For a long moment, he listened to the wind, to the silence, to the faint, imagined echo of an engine turning over one last time. The desert was quiet, but in that stillness, he heard the same sound that had begun it all. The metallic cough of diesel fading into distance. It was no longer a sound of failure. It was the echo of endurance, the heartbeat of men who had learned too late, but learned completely. And in that echo lived the law of the system, that courage without precision dies, but precision once learned never truly disappears.